Hi, I'm Dr. Emma Pomeroy, and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Archaeology and a fellow at Newman College. Today, the topic I'm going to be exploring with you is, did the Neanderthals bury their dead? Now, just a quick heads up, this presentation will include some images of human skeletal remains, and it does explore topics around the issue of death. So if you think that might be difficult for you, think about whether you want to continue watching. But I hope you stay with us. Okay, so if we're talking about the question of did the Neanderthals bury their dead, an important starting point is to make sure that we know, well, who were the Neanderthals? So they were our closest evolutionary relatives. They're shown here on the left, and this is a modern human skull here on the right. Now you can see some really key differences. Neanderthals in general were much more heavily built. You can see this kind of brow ridge over the eyes, this projecting middle part of the face, and the fact that they lack a chin, whereas a distinctive chin is something very much characteristic of our own species, modern humans. They also had much lower, longer brain cases, which suggests that the shape of their brain and perhaps the function was somewhat different compared to humans, because we have a very sort of rounded, globular brain case. So Neanderthals and us, modern humans, both originated probably around 400 to 300,000 years ago. And we shared a common ancestor, so a last common relative, about 500,000 years ago. Now, Neanderthals evolved within Europe and Asia, and this map at the bottom shows the approximate distribution from what we currently know of where Neanderthals lived. Modern humans, on the other hand, we originated in Africa, and we did spread out into other parts of the world periodically, but the major expansion of modern humans, particularly into Europe and Asia, was probably around 60 to 70,000 years ago. And it's soon after this, so humans arrive in Europe around sort of 45,000 years ago. And it's around 40,000 years ago that we see the Neanderthals go extinct. So there's been a lot of discussion as to whether these two events, the arrival of modern humans and the extinction of Neanderthals, is perhaps linked. Another thing to point out is that although we often talk about ourselves as different species, humans and Neanderthals did actually interbreed with one another. And those of us who are of non-African ancestry have perhaps 1 to 2% of Neanderthal DNA in our genomes. Now, for a long time, Neanderthals have had pretty bad press. They are, in the popular imagination, are archetypal kind of caveman. The image shown here on the left is a reconstruction of a Neanderthal from the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago from the late 1920s. And this sums up that stereotype. So a sort of hunched posture, heavily built, very simple clothing and simple tools, not very intelligent looking, perhaps rather hairy. So a really kind of primitive looking human. However, research perhaps in the last 50 years has really changed our perspective as to what Neanderthals were really like. And this is reflected in this much more recent reconstruction by the Kennis brothers. And these are two Neanderthals whose remains were found in Gibraltar. And you can see that they're actually much more human in appearance, much more friendly, like people we might actually meet in the street. And although in this case they're not wearing a great deal, we do see elements suggesting that maybe they had more sophisticated thinking. So we can see that they're wearing decoration in their body and in their hair. And this changing perspective on what Neanderthals were like covers many aspects of their behavior. So for a long time, it was thought that they didn't wear clothes, they didn't decorate their bodies in a symbolic way like we do, that they didn't create any kind of art, and that they weren't really capable of hunting animals that were hard to catch, things like small mammals like hares or birds, for example. Now though, and as this reconstruction here shows, we have more evidence that actually they were capable of many of these things. We have eagle and other raptor talons from various sites, which shown that they have been used, perhaps suspended from a cord or worn as bodily decoration. We have a couple of examples of what's been called art, although obviously it's quite basic, as you can see, that has been attributed to Neanderthals. We also have good evidence from the animal bones that we find from their sites that show that they could actually hunt these difficult animals. And equally, we have a range of evidence that suggests they engaged in complex behaviours like burying their dead. So why should we be interested in whether or not they buried their dead anyway? And rather than actually just focus on burying the dead here, I want to broaden our perspective a bit to what we might call funerary treatment. So if we look across contemporary human populations, we see that there's a whole range of ways that people treat their dead. It's not only burial, but even in our own society, in sort of Western European culture, cremation, so that's shown here actually in archaeological cremation, is fairly common. In other parts of the world, we see things like sky burials, where the bodies are exposed and the soft tissues are consumed by scavengers. We have things like water burials, famously in our imagination of the Vikings, kind of burning ship burials. And again, quite famously, at the bottom here, we have Egyptian mummies, but also mummies from other parts of the world. This one on the bottom left actually is one of the earliest mummies ever produced, and this comes from the coast of South America. And in some parts of Europe as well, we see the use of human remains, human skeletal remains, as decorative elements. So there are actually many ways that we treat the dead body. So these are important and interesting to us because whatever modern human societies do with their dead, it's usually imbued with a kind of symbolism. So it has a meaning, and the actions that we go through have meaning. They can reflect our beliefs about the world, things like whether we believe in an afterlife. They perhaps suggest that we have compassion for other members of our group and our family members, and that we mourn their loss. And they perhaps tell us something about special places and how we think about the landscape and the world around us. It's quite common that we'll have particular places for example, sky burials, or in our own sort of Western European culture, cemeteries that are dedicated to the dead. So we're interested in burial and in other funerary treatments because it tells us something about how people think about the world. And of course, this kind of complex and symbolic thought about the world is something that we understand to be quite uniquely human in the animal kingdom. So a big question is, well, when did we start to think like this? When did we become capable of this kind of symbolic, complex thought? Another important question then is, well, how do we spot an intentional and a symbolic burial or treatment of the dead? Because of course there are quite practical reasons why our ancestors might actually have buried a body. And it might have no meaning at all other than just trying to get rid of a body that could perhaps attract scavengers to where you're living, or that might start to smell after it starts to decompose. So sort of fairly hygienic reasons, if you like. Well, looking archaeologically, there are various criteria that we can use to try and identify an intentional burial. And this example on the left highlights some of these. So things like articulation of the skeleton, where the bones are still joined together in their anatomical positions, suggested that the body was covered up and that scavengers couldn't get to it, and that natural processes couldn't kind of disperse the bones. Quite often where we have a burial, the soil around the body is different from that outside the grave. And we can often see an edge to the grave, so the remnants of the edge of the hole that was dug in which to put the body. Things like body position can be quite informative. So in different cultures, we have different ways that we typically place the body. In Western European culture, it tends to be extended and on the back, as we can see here in this picture on the right. But again, repeated patterns of body position suggest to us that there's something symbolic and meaningful about the way the dead are being placed, and so that there's a symbolic component to their treatment. We can also look for things like grave goods. Here you can see this individual has a number of ceramic vessels with them, and also that they're wearing bangles on their arms. This varies a lot between cultures. So in contemporary European cultures, we don't tend to put any items in with the dead, but in many cultures we do. Looking at archaeological remains more broadly in a particular region, there are other things that we might look for too. So we can look at the orientation of the body, which can be significant in certain religions, such as Christianity and Islam. We can look at whether there are special places for the dead in the landscape, so cemeteries or even clusters of burials, suggesting that that place held some significance and people return there to bury bodies. And we can also look for markers. So again, what's most familiar to us probably is the idea of a gravestone. But there are other forms that this might take, including sort of large collective tombs taking up space in the landscape and making quite a statement. Another important question, though, is what is good enough evidence? I've mentioned that many of these factors are perhaps very specific to different cultures. So what's enough for us to say that a particular individual, perhaps where we don't have much evidence, was intentionally buried? And this is an important question when we try to identify the earliest sort of symbolic treatment of the dead in the past, when perhaps evidence is quite scant and that evidence perhaps doesn't look like modern treatments of the dead. So the example we're going to be looking at today is a place called Shanidar Cave. This is in northern Iraqi Kurdistan, and you can see an image of the cave here. To give you an idea, this fence is about the height of a person or a little taller, so it's a very large limestone cave. I've been involved in excavations here for the last several years, but it's a site that is actually very important and very well known in the field of paleoanthropology and in archaeology. Now, this is down to the work of an American archaeologist called Ralph Selecki. So this is Ralph Selecki here on the left at Shanidar Cave in 1960. So he led excavations there between 1951 and 1960. And within the large cave, so here's the mouth of the cave in this plan, he excavated quite a large trench right in the middle. And he found the remains of 10 Neanderthal men, women, and children that have played a really central role in our understanding of what Neanderthals looked like, but also in their behaviour and what they did with their dead. So the site's become very famous. One particular famous case is that of the individual known as Shanidar 4, or that's also been dubbed the flower burial. So this is that skeleton in situ, so still in the ground during excavation. The skull is here. Here we have the backbone and the ribs. Here we've got the two arms, so it's lying on its side. Here's the pelvis, the hips, the thigh bone here, and the lower leg coming back here. So it's in a crouch position on its side. This was the remains of an adult male. And what they did, which was quite pioneering at the time, was took lots of little samples of sediment from around the body itself and analysed these under a microscope, looking for pollen. And they also took samples from other parts of the site to see if there was pollen in the sediment there too. And interestingly, what they found was that in many other samples that they took, there wasn't really much pollen. But in the samples from around the body itself, there were actual clusters of pollen from at least 7 different species local to the cave, including things like hollyhocks that we're familiar with. And they suggested, therefore, that the individual had been buried with whole flowers, accounting for the fact that there were these whole sort of clumps of pollen. And they argued that this individual had been buried with funeral rituals that would seem quite familiar to us. And so that we could identify this kind of behaviour in the Neanderthals at Shanidar Cave some 70,000 years ago. And this at the bottom is just a reconstruction of what that burial might have looked like while it was in progress. Now, of course, these findings have been very controversial and been almost discounted by many because of various criticisms. So one was that the pollen could be modern day contamination. Ralph Selecki worked with a large number of local workers, and some of them, he records in his notes, liked to wear flowers in their belts as they went to work. And actually, around the edge of the cave, there were still people living there. You can see a bit of the edge of one of the huts just here. So basically, there's a lot of people going in and out of the cave, some of them even wearing flowers, and there's lots of possibilities of contamination from modern pollen. Another suggestion is that actually it could be that the pollen was brought in by burrowing rodents. So we know that there are burrowing rodents like the Jerd, shown here, that have used the cave, and Selecki recorded the fact that there were lots of burrows quite often around the skeletal remains. And Jerds in particular have been observed to actually drag entire flowers down into their burrows. So it could well be again that this was contamination from Jerds and nothing to do with any kind of funerary ritual. So the idea of the flower burial was largely discounted by many. What's also really interesting about Shanidar 4, and that's less commonly discussed, but it's also really significant, is the fact that actually Shanidar 4 was the upper individual in a cluster of at least 4 Neanderthal individuals, including 2 women and 1 baby. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a great deal of information about how these individuals related to one another. So whether they were sort of buried closely together, one on top of the other, or sort of side by side, or whether there was a gap between them, because Shanidar 4 was very, very delicate when it was found. And so what they decided to do was use a method called on-block removal. So basically you remove the whole block of soil with the skeleton in it by putting boards around the edge, covering it in plaster, and then you can excavate it in much more controlled conditions in a museum or in a lab. So this is that whole block being removed from the cave in its wooden box, and then it was transported to the Baghdad Museum, which is quite a long journey over what were probably quite bumpy roads then, and this was strapped to the top of a taxi. And it was only really when they started to excavate it in the museum a couple of years later that they discovered that there were these other individuals there. But the remains had become so jumbled by this process of removing it and transporting it that they couldn't really tell, which individual was where and what the relationship was between them. But having 4 individuals in such a small area, so perhaps 1 meter by 1 meter by 50 centimeters depth, is really quite unprecedented in what we know about Neanderthal treatment of the dead. So this was really significant. Unfortunately, though, there was limited amount that we can say about it because of the way in which it was excavated. So in the last 5 years, we've been conducting new excavations at Shanidar Cave. No excavations have been done there since 1960. Ralph Selecki had tried to go back, and he'd got back to the cave, but never actually been able to excavate because of the political situation there. So by 2010, the trench that he dug, which we can see here, had become filled in. And since 2015, a team led by Professor Graham Barker from Cambridge, at the invitation of the Kurdish regional government, have been opening up Ralph Selecki's excavations again to use the whole range of modern archaeological science to get a better understanding of the environment that Neanderthals and modern humans lived in, what they ate, what they did, and also to use modern dating techniques to understand when they were used in the cave. Now, as we dug down into some of the deeper parts of the excavations, where you can see this person here, we found, very excitingly, the remains of a Neanderthal individual. And this was particularly exciting because we were able to show that this individual was lying right next to where they removed that block containing Shanidar 4. So here's Ralph Selecki in this picture on the left, and the block, you can see they're cutting around the edge to remove it. Here's Shanidar 4 in the middle. And there's this really distinctive stone here. And this we were able to identify as this stone here. There are other characteristics like this kind of hollow behind that we also were able to match up. And as we cleaned the wall of the excavation in this area here, you can see these little dark dots, and these are bits of Neanderthal bones in position. So this was super exciting because what we've got here is some remains of a Neanderthal still in their original position that we know are right next to that original Shanidar 4 flower burial. And we can use all sorts of modern scientific techniques that Ralph Selecki didn't have at his disposal to investigate questions of whether this individual might have been intentionally buried and whether there may have been any ritual component to that burial. So what we had to do was excavate down from above. So we always excavate in plan. And that meant that we had to remove a lot of this material that you can see behind the people here in this picture. But when we eventually got there, we have a very exciting find of a complete Neanderthal skull. Now it's quite squashed, but hopefully you can see here the lower jaw. Here's the upper jaw and some of the teeth. Here's the right eye. Here's the left eye. And then here's the forehead, and then round to the back of the skull here. And as I said, this is really exciting because it means that we can start to use modern science to investigate some of the questions we have about what Neanderthals were doing with their dead. We called this individual Shanidar Z because we're not sure whether actually it might be part of those same individuals that Ralph Selecki and his team removed in 1960. It's a possibility that this is actually part of the individual called Shanidar 6, but that's something we're still working to confirm. So although it's very crushed, once we lifted up the skull, beneath that we have a fairly complete left hand here. Here's the wrist and the forearm, the two shoulders here, and right underneath that, a fairly complete rib cage and spine. So this is the edge of where Ralph Selecki excavated, so he's kind of cut through this individual at the waist in removing that block containing Shanidar 4. So probably the rest of that individual was underneath or right next to the flower burial. And this is the reconstruction of the position we think they were probably must have been lying in. There's some important things we can observe here. So the remains are articulated, suggesting they were protected from the elements and from scavengers soon after death, one of our criteria for intentional burial. Another thing that's really exciting is that we can use what's known as soil micromorphology to tell us much more about what actually happened in the formation of that particular archaeological deposit. Now let me unpack that a bit for you. So soil micromorphology is where we take a whole block of soil intact out of an excavation. We take it back to the lab, we impregnate it with wax to stabilize it, and then we cut very, very thin slices like the one you can see here on the right and look at it under a microscope, because there's lots we can actually tell about the microscopic structure of the soil that tells us something about how those soils were formed. So what we did was we took a block from the edge here, so crossing the area between where we have Neanderthal bones and where there are none, and you cut around the edge of it like this. This is a block being taken from somewhere else on the site. You remove the whole thing, like I said, and then in the lab, we're able to look at thin slices under the microscope. Now, there's a few important things that we can see here. These two oval shaped things you can see are actually two of the ribs of the Neanderthal. So we know we're in exactly the right place. Hopefully you can see that there's a very clear difference between the soil containing the bones, which is much darker and sort of mottled, and the soil directly underneath, which is much lighter. Now, this suggests that we have a different fill, so a different soil around the bones. Again, one of our criteria for intentional burial. Something we can also see, and you can perhaps not see it from this slide, but specialists in this technique can tell us that actually the soil just underneath the soil containing the bones is much more compact. Now, this is a sign that the soil has been intentionally dug out from above that point. So imagine if you're digging a hole in the soil, whatever you're using to scoop out the soil will push down and compress the soil just underneath. And that's exactly what we can see has happened here. It seems like there was actually a natural kind of water channel just here, and that therefore Neanderthals actually dug that out to make it a bit deeper to place the body. Another very exciting find was in some of these sort of voids, these empty areas here were mineralized, so preserved ancient plant remains. We're still doing many of the analysis to check exactly what kind of plants these were and how they might have got there. But again, this is exciting because it suggests that we might have preservation of genuine ancient plant remains, perhaps even including flowers associated with the burial of this individual. This is important because it gives us an opportunity to revisit those debates about the original flower burial and whether actually the pollen found there might have been ancient too. Another final aspect that's of great interest to us is whether there might have been markers used to show where these individuals were buried. Because as I said before, we've got a cluster of a number of individuals in a very specific point in the cave. It's a huge cave, and yet we've got at least 4 individuals within this very small area. And interestingly, there was this stone here, which was the distinctive one. This is this one here, that was found next to the individual, right behind the skull. So you can see the outline of the skull here. And this stone's unusual, both because of its shape. It doesn't seem a very natural shape here, but also because in that level of the cave, there aren't many other stones like this. In some levels, when there's been a lot of collapse from the roof, there are many more stones, but not here, which suggests that perhaps it's been put there. Another possibility for a marker is this big stone that you can see here, this sort of vertical slab. Now that had fallen from the roof probably quite a long time before the individuals were buried here. And that too may have acted like some kind of natural marker for where those individuals were, so that Neanderthals could go back and place individuals there on different occasions. I mentioned that we couldn't tell whether the 4 individuals in that block with Shanidar 4 were all put there at the same time. But interestingly, as we've excavated down below, so this is Shanidar Z, we've excavated further down here, we have found that there is a gap filled with soil, and then below that even more Neanderthal remains, suggesting that they did go back at least twice to this very same spot to bury their dead. So perhaps can we say that Shanidar 4 was a flower burial after all? Well, we need to be a little bit cautious. That would be really exciting, but we've got a lot of analysis still to do. This is really early days. And just because we find plant remains with our new find, Shanidar Z, doesn't mean that those with Shanidar 4 are genuinely ancient or are flowers that were ritually placed there. Even though it's right next to Shanidar Z, there could be different things going on with the 2 individuals. But it does suggest that actually this is a possibility, and that the pollen found with Shanidar 4 may not be modern contamination and may actually be ancient. We're trying to track down those original samples that were analysed to see if we can reanalyse them with the extent of modern knowledge that we have. So, in conclusion, did Neanderthals bury their dead? It seems probably they did from what we know from Shanidar and from what we know at other sites. And we know that they also did other things with their dead. We see in different parts of their range that they did things like even consume the remains of individuals, a form of cannibalism, although we know that modern humans were actually doing something similar at the same time too. Did this fury behaviour have a symbolic component? It also seems like it might have done, but that's something that we're trying to unpick further today with modern archaeological techniques. So watch this space in the next few years for hopefully some exciting discoveries. And finally, just a quick thank you to all of you for listening, and to the members of the team, the Kurdistan Regional Government who support the work, and various others who've been instrumental in the analyses. If you're interested in finding out more about Neanderthals and their behaviour, I've suggested some readings that you can follow up with.